The wind carried dust instead of snow across the dry plains as Eleanor Price stumbled along the narrow road. Her boots were worn thin, and every step sent a sharp ache through her feet. The sun had already begun to fall behind the distant hills, painting the sky in deep orange and fading gold. She had been walking for 2 days with barely any food and even less hope. But she kept moving because stopping meant going back. And going back was not an option. Eleanor tightened her grip on the small cloth bag she carried. It held everything she had left: a change of clothes, a small photograph, and a few coins that would not last another day. The town she had left behind had taken everything else: her job, her home, her dignity. She had spent weeks trying to survive without asking for help. But hunger and cold had a way of breaking even the strongest pride. By the time she reached the edge of the valley, she knew one thing: she needed shelter, and she would have to ask for it. The ranch came into view just as the last light of day faded. A wide stretch of land with a weathered wooden house and a large barn standing against the open sky. The fences looked old but strong. Cattle moved slowly in the distance, and smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Someone lived here. Eleanor stopped at the gate for a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never begged before, but tonight pride would not keep her alive. She pushed the gate open and walked slowly toward the house. The gravel crunched under her boots, echoing loudly in the quiet evening. When she reached the porch, she hesitated only for a second before raising her hand and knocking. The sound seemed too loud in the stillness. Seconds passed. Then heavy footsteps approached from inside. The door opened slowly. A tall man stood in the doorway. His face was partially hidden by shadow, but the deep scar running from his left temple down to his jaw was impossible to miss. It twisted slightly when he moved, giving his expression a permanent hardness. His eyes studied her carefully, cold but not cruel. "What do you want?" His voice was rough and low. Eleanor swallowed the fear rising in her throat. I'm looking for shelter for the night." The man didn't respond immediately. His gaze moved from her face to her worn clothes to the small bag in her hand. He had seen people like her before: drifters, runaways, people with nowhere else to go. "There's a town 10 miles back," he said flatly. "I came from there," she whispered. "I can't go back." The wind picked up slightly, pulling at her thin coat. The man remained silent. Then Eleanor forced herself to say the words she had been avoiding all day. "I can work," she added quickly. "I'll cook, clean, tend animals, anything. You won't have to give me anything for free." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He had heard promises like that before. Most didn't last. But something in her voice was different. It wasn't desperation alone. It was determination mixed with exhaustion. He stepped aside slowly. "Come in." Eleanor blinked in surprise for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin hit her instantly, making her knees feel weak. The man closed the door behind her and walked past her toward the fireplace. "You can sit," he said shortly. She moved to the nearest chair and sat carefully. The room was simple but clean. A wooden table stood near the window, and a pot simmered slowly over the fire. The man grabbed a second bowl and poured some stew before placing it in front of her. Eleanor stared at it for a second, then looked up. "Thank you." He didn't respond. She began eating slowly at first, but hunger quickly took over. She finished the bowl faster than she expected. The man watched quietly from across the room. "Name?" he asked. Eleanor wiped her hands gently. "Eleanor." He nodded once. "Caleb." Silence filled the cabin again, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. Caleb leaned against the wall, studying her. "You said you can work," he said. "I can," she replied firmly. He crossed his arms. "Ranch work isn't easy." Eleanor met his gaze. "Neither is sleeping in the cold." For the first time, something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Fair enough, he muttered. He walked to the door and glanced outside at the darkening sky. Storm's coming, he said. You can stay tonight. Relief washed over Eleanor so suddenly she had to steady herself. Thank you. Caleb turned back toward her. If you're still here in the morning, you work. She nodded quickly. I will. That night, Eleanor slept in a small room at the back of the cabin. The bed was simple but warm. For the first time in weeks, she slept without fear. When morning came, the wind howled across the plains, carrying the first signs of a dust storm. Eleanor woke early and stepped outside. She found Caleb already working near the barn, repairing part of the fence without a word. She grabbed a loose board and held it steady for him. He glanced at her briefly but said nothing. They worked side by side for nearly an hour, fixing broken posts and reinforcing the gate. The wind grew stronger, pushing dust across the fields. Animals need water before the storm hits, Caleb said finally. Eleanor followed him to the trough, carrying buckets without complaint. Her hands grew sore and her arms ached, but she didn't stop. Caleb watched her quietly. She worked harder than most people he had hired in the past. By midday, the storm had arrived fully. The sky turned dark and the wind roared across the ranch. Eleanor helped secure the barn doors and check on the cattle despite the harsh conditions. When they finally returned to the cabin, both were covered in dust. Caleb handed her a cloth without a word. Eleanor wiped her face and gave a small, tired smile. Still think I can't handle ranch work? Caleb shook his head slightly. Haven't decided yet. But there was something different in his tone now. Respect. Days turned into a week. Eleanor worked from sunrise to sunset. She cooked meals, cleaned the cabin, and helped with the animals. She never complained. She never asked for anything more than a place to stay. Caleb remained quiet most of the time, but he noticed everything. He noticed how she fixed small problems before he mentioned them, how she cared for the animals gently but firmly, how she never wasted food or time. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Caleb finally spoke. You can stay longer, he said. Eleanor looked up surprised. I don't want to impose. You're not, he interrupted. Ranch needs the help. She nodded slowly, but something in her eyes softened. Thank you. Caleb looked into the fire for a moment before speaking again. People in town, they see this scar and think they know me. His hand moved unconsciously toward his face. Most don't stay long. Eleanor studied him quietly. Scars don't tell the whole story, she said softly. Caleb glanced at her, then looked away. The fire crackled between them, and for the first time in years, the silence inside the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt shared. And Eleanor realized something she hadn't expected when she first knocked on that door. She had come here willing to trade her pride just to survive. But what she was beginning to find was something far greater than shelter. And that realization both comforted and frightened her at the same time. Eleanor lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the wooden ceiling above her. The wind outside had quieted, but her thoughts had not. She had come to this ranch with one simple goal: survive, ask for shelter, work for food, leave when she could stand on her own again. But now something was changing, and that change scared her more than the cold nights ever had. Morning came with a pale golden light stretching across the plains. Eleanor stepped outside early as usual. She found Caleb near the corral checking the horses. The air felt calmer after the storm, but the land still carried its weight. Morning, she said softly. Caleb nodded once. Morning. They worked in silence for a while, feeding the animals and repairing small damage left by the storm. But today felt different. Eleanor noticed it in the way Caleb spoke, short as always, but less distant, less guarded. By midday, they moved to the far fence line, where a section had broken under the heavy wind. Caleb hammered nails into place while Eleanor held the board steady. At one point, the wood slipped, and her hand brushed against his. He paused for a brief second before continuing. Neither of them spoke about it, but the moment lingered quietly between them. Later that evening, they sat inside the cabin as the fire burned low. Eleanor stirred a pot of stew, while Caleb leaned back in his chair watching the flames. "You work harder than most men I've hired," he said suddenly. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder with a faint smile. "Guess I have more to prove." Caleb shook his head slowly. "You already proved it." She turned back to the pot, but his words settled deep inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not judged, not pitied, just recognized. Days turned into weeks. The ranch slowly improved under their shared effort. Fences stood stronger, the animals grew healthier, and the cabin felt warmer, even on the coldest nights. Eleanor began to notice small things about Caleb that others might have missed. He always checked the animals before eating. He repaired tools instead of replacing them. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. And despite the scar that marked his face, there was a quiet kindness in the way he moved through the world. One afternoon, while they worked near the barn, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been in her mind since the day she arrived. "How did you get the scar?" Caleb paused for a moment. The wind moved lightly through the field. He rested his hand on the fence post before answering. "Fire," he said simply. Eleanor waited, but he didn't continue. She stepped closer. "You don't have to tell me." Caleb looked at her then. For a long moment, his eyes searched hers as if deciding something. Then he spoke quietly. "Happened years ago. Barn caught fire during a storm." His voice remained steady, but his gaze shifted toward the distant hills. "I got most of the animals out, not all of them." Eleanor felt a heaviness settle in her chest. Caleb continued, "People in town said it was my fault. After that, I stopped caring what they thought." Eleanor shook her head gently. "You saved what you could. That's not failure." Caleb let out a slow breath. "Doesn't always feel that way." For the first time, she reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm. "You're not the man they think you are." He looked down at her hand, then back at her face. Something softened in his expression. Not weakness, but trust. That evening, the silence between them changed again. It was no longer the quiet of strangers, but the calm of two people who understood each other without needing many words. As spring approached, the plains began to shift. The cold winds softened and patches of green slowly returned to the land. The ranch no longer felt like a place of survival. It felt like a place of growth. One morning, Eleanor stood near the porch watching the sunrise. The sky glowed with soft pink and gold. Caleb stepped beside her. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She watched the light spread across the fields. The same land that had once felt like a last chance now felt like something more. "I used to," she admitted. "Every day." Caleb nodded slowly. "And now?" She turned to face him. "Now, I'm not sure I want to." The words hung in the air between them. Caleb looked at her quietly as if weighing something important. "You don't have to stay because you owe me," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not staying because I owe you." She took a small breath before continuing. "I'm staying because this place feels like home." Caleb's gaze softened in a way she had never seen before. He looked out across the ranch, then back at her. "Then stay," he said simply. Eleanor smiled, a real smile this time, not forced by survival or politeness, but something deeper, the kind that comes when fear finally loosens its grip. She had come to this ranch willing to trade her pride just to survive. But what she found instead was something she never dared to hope for. A place where she was valued, a place where she belonged, and a man who saw her not as someone broken, but as someone worth keeping. And in the quiet of that morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Eleanor realized she had not lost her pride at all. She had simply found something far more important to hold on to.